All right, welcome back to Social 30 for the final lesson of the year. This is a lesson on the contemporary world. The contemporary world, to borrow a descriptor from the former department head here at WCHS, Dan Rates, it really truly is a mile wide. There's many, many topics within it, but it's only about an inch deep. We don't expect you to know a lot about each one of these topics. So I'm going to reintroduce you to a number of topics, but we're not expecting you to be an expert on them. I do have a visual on the sideboard that is meant to help us get through this lesson. So the contemporary world. When we think of the contemporary world, we might be thinking of social issues. So on the diploma exam, on the multiple choice, or even on an A1, there might be a reference to social issues. Social issues in the United States could include the Black Lives Matter movement following the death of Trayvon Martin. Or it could include the #MeToo movement. Both of those movements have been reshaping our social lives in our last decade. Both of those movements are after the after the textbook was created. So you won't find any reference to them in the textbook. But liberalism is by definition an ideology that evolves. And it's meant to see progress. And one tenet of it, one facet of it, is social. So in terms of social liberalism, in terms of our social norms, the way we interact with others in society, we have these two issues that have been quite conversational. Black Lives Matter and #MeToo. So if you take a look at Trayvon Martin's story, we go back to 2012. And we're in Florida, and he's simply walking, and he has his hood up, and there's a individual, last name Zimmerman, who wasn't even a police officer, but more of a community police agent, and stops him, has an altercation, and will end up, Trayvon Martin will be shot. This case will lead to national outrage, including some from then President Barack Obama, who says when he looks at Trayvon Martin, it's like he could be looking at his son. And he can't believe that in America in 2012 this is still possible, that innocent people are being killed. So this will lead to the #Black Lives Matter movement, because it's not even an awakening, but a reawakening of the idea that there's a disproportionate amount of shootings that target African Americans in America. Now, connecting Trayvon Martin and Black Lives Matter, we can go back to the spring of 2020. And there are a number of riots, you may remember, throughout the United States following the murder of George Floyd, that in Minneapolis, Minnesota, May of 2020, you may remember this, right at the beginning of the COVID lockdowns here in Canada, we had George Floyd was killed, and in America there's all of these riots that broke out because it was caught on video, and it was another example of how some lives were not seen as important, as valuable, and he was killed by the police. So we had a lot of riots there as well. We also have seen in America riots between those trying to see social progress and those conservative elements trying to resist it. So we've seen the Black Lives Matter movement clashing to some extent with some of the supporters of Donald Trump, like Proud Boys and groups within society like that. So you might see a reference to racial issues in America. On the multiple choice or on the A1, the idea of prejudice and bigotry and racism, and how we had the civil rights movement back in the 1950s and 60s. And yet we still have that today. Could be a testable concept that has a connection to the contemporary world. Any questions about that racial side of things? In a more Canadian sense, the racial side of things may be looking at our societal interactions with Canada's First Nations Indigenous people. That in Canada, we have a history of assimilation, cultural genocide, and we've had an attempt at truth and reconciliation by the government, but some would argue that the attempt was more for show, that we don't have reconciliation. We still have a divided Canada because there's poverty and hopelessness on some reservations, and there's a lack of clean water on many in many northern communities. Another social issue that we could see is that fourth wave of feminism. So we talked about the four waves of feminism. The fourth wave of feminism fits into the contemporary unit, the hashtag #MeToo part of feminism. The redefinition of how we connect and how we communicate our concerns about how we've been treated based upon our gender. Even gender identification, we saw that on a field test, didn't we? Not that we're allowed to talk about field tests, so I'm not talking about a field test because we sign a little waiver thing. So I'm not talking about a field test. That would be wrong of me to say stuff like that. But let's just say that gender identification is something that is a part of the contemporary world, changing norms, right? It used to be that we saw the world very binary, one and zeros, right? Males and females. And now we're seeing that there's many, many different genders that have been identified. So, that could also be on an exam. Another way to look at the contemporary world would be looking at the contemporary world by looking at pro-democracy movements. So we've had a pro-democracy movement that was the Arab Spring. We've talked about the Arab Spring earlier in this course. Arab Spring beginning in 2010, but really defining the year of 2011. Beginning in Tunisia with the Jasmine merchant that defied the police, didn't like being victim of extortion, refused to pay those bribes, and lit himself on fire in protest and died. And that act of defiance against elements of authoritarianism ended up spreading to neighboring countries in North Africa and eventually the Middle East, and it created some regime changes. Probably most significantly in Egypt and then in Libya, where the long-established authoritarian governments were toppled due to the will of the people. So you might see some references to these contemporary pro-democracy movements, one specifically the Arab Spring. Connecting to that would be some of the civil wars that were created as a result. The civil war in Libya, the civil war in Syria. So the Libyan Civil War, we're going to want to know the name Muammar Gaddafi. We want to be able to recognize Muammar Gaddafi's name and recognize that there is some controversy surrounding, to what extent has liberalism moving to Libya been good for the Libyan people? So I've created some questions that I've shown you in multiple choice already this year, and you'll see some more this week, where we contrast Libya before and after the Arab Spring. And we see the stability, the security, and the progress that was achieved under Muammar Gaddafi, and then the turmoil during the Civil War. So in Libya's case, the toppling of Muammar Gaddafi's regime, and there's Gaddafi's name there, the toppling of his regime actually led to a plummeting of the standard of living, quality of life of the Libyan people. So that's a nuance, right? Liberalism. When liberalism is imposed, or when liberalism just begins to take over a country, do lives get better automatically? The answer is no. We saw that in the Soviet Union as it transitioned it into Russia, and we're seeing it in Libya today as well. So we might see Libya. We might see a reference to the Syrian Civil War. Syrian Civil War created a refugee crisis that would have been very controversial and very conversational, I guess I meant to say, 3 years ago. And there were people trying to flee into Europe, and not everyone made it there. And some children were washing up on beaches, and that was quite graphic. You know, what caused the Syrian Civil War? What role did the Russians and the Americans play in either trying to prop up the authoritarian regime there or trying to dispose it? And just a reference to the Syrian Civil War and that conversation about terrorism we had in a previous class. That this is a way for elements of liberalism and non-liberalism to fight in the Middle East. So in Syria, we saw ISIS and ISIL and some of the Islamic fundamentalists fighting against American interests in what really became a jihad on top of a civil war. And we had the Russians and the Turks and the Americans sometimes supporting different players in it. So potentially the oldest city in the world is Damascus, the capital of Syria. And if you look at a map of Damascus today or an aerial view of Damascus, the city is very devastated. And that's largely due to the civil war that has been fought there. So you might have reference to Syria. Now the textbook talks about Haiti, because when the textbook was created 15 years ago, Haiti was the failed country in the Western Hemisphere that was struggling, and the textbook introduces it to try to get us to think about, you know, what responsibility do countries have to support citizens of other countries? You know, what responsibility do Canadians have for Haitian people? Well, we don't talk about Haiti much, but this year we've been talking about Ukraine a lot. You know, what responsibility do Canadians have for Ukrainian people? How can we help people that have been upset by either domestic or international warfare? So you could see a reference to Haiti, Syria, or Libya. You won't see a reference to Ukraine on the exam because it's too new, but you may see a reference to Putin's foreign policy because he'd already began to expand. He'd already began to, you know, seize territory in the Crimea. He'd already began to try to manipulate politics in Moldova and in other areas in what is becoming southwest Russia. So we could see some civil wars connected to pro-democracy movements as well. Included in that nuance is a look at what I would call non-liberal states. So we should expect to see some kind of reference to North Korea. North Korea is an authoritarian state still existing in Stalin's image. That we understand that North Korea today is economically, politically, and socially quite isolated. It's a hermit kingdom. And because of that, the people there, their quality of life, standard of living, is significantly less than their South Korean, you know, neighbors. If you are planning to write about North Korea on a political essay, make sure you do more research. So you have some numbers to contrast the per capita GDPs. Some numbers to talk about what percentage of the population is imprisoned. Some ideas to talk about, you know, the 3 generations of being imprisoned. You know, this idea of generational guilt. But on the multiple choice, if they're going to use, you know, Cuba or North Korea or Iran, the answer is probably in the source. Because they can't guarantee that every classroom in the province is going into great detail about Cuba, North Korea, Iran, maybe an African authoritarian state. So there could be a source on the diploma exam and you're like, man, this is from a subject, a context, a case study that I'm not familiar with. That might be by design. They want to test you on whether you can look at something that's less familiar to see what is familiar. So it's a source about Zimbabwe, but the answer is indoctrination, a concept that you should know. Or the answer is propaganda, or it's looking at scapegoatism. It's looking at techniques of dictatorship. So we might use contemporary non-liberal states to test the concepts that we learned by looking at Hitler's Germany and Stalin's USSR. We're more likely to see Hitler and Stalin, but sometimes we'll throw Cuba, China, North Korea, Afghanistan, Iran as placeholders for that, just to see if students can adapt to a new scenario. Now, in Afghanistan, you could see some reference to NATO and Canada's role in Afghanistan in trying to nation build, and some of the difficulties Canadians faced in Afghanistan fighting against forces of Al-Qaeda, but mostly the Taliban. I've seen a lot of sources on Afghanistan that try to weigh, what kind of civil development has Canada accomplished against the cost of it. Contrasting, the re-engineering of a country with the military costs associated. And obviously in our previous lesson we already looked at the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, and that would also fit under the umbrella of contemporary world. Iran is up there because Iran was labeled as part of the axis of evil along with Syria and Iraq, North Korea, and in Iran today it really fits in with some of the other topics on the board, like social issues, like gender equality. We know that women are not as equal in Saudi Arabia and Iran as they would be here in Canada. And we also know that in Iran they still have public stoning. And those types of things may be too graphic to build a multiple choice question around, or they might be able to do it depending upon the source that they pick. But Iran has been very conversational in the last 10 years. It's a part of the world that gets our attention and therefore could be on the exam. The idea of, how does America police areas of the world that are acting in rogue or outlaw type manners? So then we would expect to see things like sanctions included. And we've seen a lot of sanctions used against Russia as a consequence of their invasion of Ukraine. There's some more historic part of the contemporary world that might fit in here. One of the historic parts of the contemporary world that might fit in here is the concept of apartheid. Apartheid's in the textbook, so I haven't done a whole lot in teaching you about it because I understand that you guys read the textbook before the class began. But just in case you can't remember, apartheid was the institutional segregation in South Africa. So in America, we studied Jim Crow laws. And when we studied Jim Crow, we talked about segregation, separation of people, blacks and whites. In South Africa, they had a system called apartheid, apartness, in the language of the Africans, of the Afrikaner language. And it is this idea of having whites and non-whites separate. And I often describe South Africa under apartheid as it was a democracy for whites and it was an authoritarian state for non-whites. That the human rights that the citizens had were different based upon what ethnic group they belonged to. So apartheid is this institutional segregation, and you may remember that apartheid doesn't exist in South Africa anymore. And one of the reasons that it stopped existing, is that the world was quite united in its opposition to apartheid. And they tried to punish South Africa through sanctions, sometimes moral sanctions, sometimes economic and sports sanctions. Sports sanctions, we're not going to invite you to this rugby tournament. We're not going to invite you to this football tournament. We're not going to invite you to this, what's that, cricket? That cricket tournament. That's the other big sport that those British colonials like to play. Or moral sanctions. We are going to publicly promote the fact that we need to end South Africa's apartheid, end apartheid in South Africa. We are going to have economic sanctions. We're not going to trade with you. South Africa's main exports are diamonds and gold. Diamonds and gold you can't eat. If no one's buying diamonds and gold, your people are suffering. They're struggling. So economic, moral, sports sanctions all tried to isolate, marginalize the apartheid government to the point that they eventually freed Nelson Mandela, allowed him to run in elections, and he became the first black African president of South Africa. Sir, yes, sir.
Why did everyone care?
Why did everyone care about them and not other places in the world?
Yeah.
I've never been asked that. That's a good question. Let me think about that. Why did people care? Because obviously it's not the only place in the world with racial inequality. So why care about there? I don't know if I have an easy answer for you. So possibly during the Cold War they cared because it was a state that was kind of up for grabs in terms of allegiance. So the United States, South Africa were still competing, or sorry, the Soviet Union was still competing for South Africa's loyalty, but I don't think that's the answer. They would care in America because it's a continuation of the civil rights movement that they had already gone through in America, but it's not like the civil rights movement in America was done, that equality was achieved. So we care about something happening there, but we still have problems here. Sometimes it's easier to look at what's happening there and try to fix that than to fix your own stuff. So in Canada, we often don't talk about our own problems because it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to recognize the fact that, you know what, we have a system that's broken too. So it's easier for us to look into someone else's system, be critical of theirs, and than it is to look into our own. I don't know if that's why we cared in Canada. You got me interested though. You know, why did people care about apartheid so much? Because again, there's other countries that had racial divisions. You know, you could make the argument that in Israel today they have apartheid. That there's an apartheid wall in Israel. That on one side you have Israeli Jews, on one side you have Israeli Palestinians. And the amount of freedom that they have is determined by which culture and ethnic group they belong to. Why don't we care more about the apartheid wall in Israel today? You know, why did we not seem to care when divisions in Rwanda led to a genocide in 1994 where 800,000 people were chopped to death in 100 days? How come we just watched that? We didn't care enough. I don't have an answer for it. I think humanity in general has times when we needed to care more and we didn't. So maybe a better question is, why don't we care about the other ones? But that was a good question. We also have the idea of failing democracies. So in the contemporary world umbrella, we could look at the threats to democracies, like corporatocracy that we talked about in that unit, the undue influence of the military-industrial complex, Boeing, and companies like that. We also have this whole umbrella of organizations and agreements. And we're going to end on that. And there's a lot of them. Most are from Social 10. But at the risk of sounding funny again, I know I've been saying it all year. I only taught 4 of you Social 10, and it's been a long time. And it's probably easy to assume that we've forgotten what we did then. So we should expect within the contemporary world umbrella to hear about NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, created in 1949. An attack on one is an attack on all. It's a collective security agreement. It's a military alliance. NATO is very conversational right now. Ukraine's not in NATO, but Lithuania is. So if Russia attacks Lithuania, they're attacking NATO, and the United States has already declared that they'll use nuclear weapons to defend NATO. So NATO is our military group, the most significant military group on the planet, and I would say that today it seems a lot more important than the UN. What is the UN? In 1945, at the end of World War II, the countries that fought in the war, they had this idea again, never again, right? Never again should we want to fight a war like that. That the League of Nations failed. We need something better than the League, something similar, a forum for international discussion to prevent international lawlessness, and that's where the idea of a United Nations came up. The United Nations has had many flaws, but some success stories too. This test could include some reference to the UN. The Security Council with its 5 permanent members, United States and Russia and China and France and Britain, and how they get to veto any Security Council commitment to military operations, peacekeeping, peacemaking. UN might be included under the umbrella of the World Health Organization in fighting against pandemics. We've also seen through Bretton Woods from Social 10 the role of the IMF and World Bank to rebuild the world at the end of the war, but also to spread liberalism, to spread capitalism to the developing parts of the world, but very controversially, that with their aid comes some kind of conditions. In Bolivia, Social 10, we look at Cochabamba, and they needed money for the water, the infrastructure, new sanitation pipes and stuff like that. So the IMF and World Bank said, you know what, here you go. You can have some money, but you need to privatize your water. Bechtel, transnational company from San Francisco, buys the rights to the water, increases the price of water, and then there's a water war in the city of Cochabamba in Bolivia. Not like a water fight, actual people die. So we have the American influencing economic kind of, it's not imperialism anymore, it's like a new form of imperialism, neo-economic imperialism, using the power of the US dollar to try to control hearts and minds of people around the world. I can almost guarantee you're going to see that idea on an A1 this week from me, right? This idea that the United States is using the IMF, the World Bank, to spread American transnational capitalist agenda, their 1% at the expense of the global 99%, so that they can become more rich at the expense of, the people of Cochabamba that can't afford water. We also have related terms like the G8, the G20, and APEC, and the EU. With the EU, we might have a reference to Brexit. If Brexit, the start date of Brexit was 2020, then it's just that close to being able to develop a question, field test a question, and put it on your multiple choice. So Brexit would have been conversational, should the United Kingdom leave the EU, when some of your questions were being made. So there's this idea of what is nationalism, internationalism, supranationalism. Internationalism is nations working together. But when nations work together and the boundaries of the nations blur, they might become supranationalist. The people in the United Kingdom voted against that. They are like, we don't like the blurring of the lines. We don't like losing control over our borders and our monetary policy. We want to go back to nationalism, not go ahead to supranationalism. So they had a referendum, they voted to leave the EU. So we might have a reference to that. G8 and the G20, the G7, G8, G20. When we talk about the G7 and the G8, the G77, the G20, the G is just group. So group of 7, group of 8, group of 77, group of 20, whatever it is. How many countries are we inviting to this conference? The G7 was meant to be 7 of the largest economies of the world when it was created. So this was the G7. You're noticing, though, like, hey, man, where's China? Well, when the G7 was created, back in the early 1970s, the Chinese economy wasn't as significant as it is today. So that's where the G7 group might not be as significant as it once was. But we do have groups like the group of 7, the group of 8, the group of 77, that governments get together and they try to organize the world economy. You might see some reference to that on the exam. Any question about anything on the sideboard? So there's lots up there. Lots up there. Environmental disaster, I didn't even get to that. Climate change. We don't have the Kyoto Accord anymore. We're not going to see Kyoto, but we might see the Paris Peace Agreements, right? The Paris Climate Accords of 2015. The idea of the lack of sustainable prosperity, the climate change that has resulted from our economic activities. This is a threat to economic liberalism. The environmental consequence of capitalism is a threat to economic liberalism. That's chapter 12 of the textbook. That it was once thought that Marxism was the antithesis of capitalism. I would think that the biggest force fighting against capitalism is the environmental cost of capitalism. That's why capitalism may not be sustainable for the next 100 years, is that the environmental cost is too much. So that's it for the contemporary world. I'll stop recording and see if you have any questions.